good morning, good evening, wherever to those people watching online. My name is Kip Hale. I'm the Chief of Staff to the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine, and also the Georgetown Law International Criminal Justice Initiative, which is the lead implementing entity of ACA, which I'll go into a little bit later. Let me first begin by thanking the organizers, both the Latvian government, the Ukrainian government, and all others who's helped. I think I speak for everyone in attendance and the panelists here, how well this has been organized and coordinated, which is most appropriate given the subject matter at hand. I come with apologies on behalf of Ambassador Clint Williamson, who is the lead coordinator of ACA. He would usually be in this situation, and also with apologies that you have to deal with me instead. If I could take a point of privilege before we get to our very impressive panel, I just thought I would provide a little bit of background information on some of the things I've already mentioned. One thing that sometimes I think is said by international criminal practitioners such as myself, that the word atrocity crimes. The word atrocity crimes is an umbrella term that encapsulates war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and crimes of aggression. That term was created both to separate out the core international crimes that, again, we're all here to discuss and learn more about, but also to indicate that there's no hierarchy of crimes. That's very much we see in case here, unfortunately, in Ukraine, where we're seeing children being the victims of potentially all four of these atrocity crimes. As I mentioned, I'm the Chief of Staff to ACA, or the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. My employer would be remiss if I didn't mention what that is. The Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine is a joint initiative of the European Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom to provide on-the-ground expert practical support to the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine in their atrocity crimes work. And so this is the official support of those governments, again, on the ground. As you met earlier, my colleague Shyam Patel, he represents the EU assistance mission to Ukraine. I myself work for Georgetown Law, the lead implementing entity. And then there's some other entities that you've probably heard about who are part of ACA as well. Global Rights Compliance, International Development Law Organization, and Bravo Justice. Now, why is ACA important? And we're going to get to this, I'm sure, when we discuss with the panel. I always like to point this out when I'm speaking at such august gatherings such as this one, that what the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's Office is trying to do, and is successfully doing thus far, is unprecedented. It is unprecedented because it's a domestic jurisdiction that has unquestioned jurisdiction and competence for the atrocity crimes in their territory. They're doing it while they're prosecuting a hot kinetic war, and they're doing this while they're, with war crime and atrocity crimes investigators and prosecutors literally working alongside military officials who are already fighting this war. Now, in that regard, so there's something unprecedented, and hence ACA itself is an unprecedented response by the international community. One thing I want to also highlight to why is this support so important. I was recently at a conference in New York talking about this, and that the Yugoslav tribunal's last case was just about 6 months ago. Those were crimes that started in the early 90s. So this effort of what the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's Office is not months long, it's not years long, it's decades long. And that does sound daunting, but I definitely feel energized by the people in this room, the people that I've met, and the comments that we've heard, that we can accomplish that. So, I also want to make one final point before giving introductions to our panel. And that is, my wife recently, when I started working for ACA last year, she mentioned to me that this is my 8th conflict that I've either investigated, prosecuted, or advised the investigators and prosecutors in doing that. And when I mention that, I often get people to ask me to try to compare conflicts, which is something I'm loath to do. I'm loath to also compare criminality. They're all incredible traumatic events. But I think given the subject matter that we're talking today, it is very important, as others have talked about, the multidimensional trauma that deportation of children has. Present-day trauma for their families and the children themselves, and without knowing what is going to come. And thankfully, if they are reunited, an ongoing trauma of what these children had to go through, what their family had to go through. And again, another aspect of the types of longevity of the support that we need to give to the Ukrainians. Now, let me introduce the panel, which gets to the part of the discussion that I have the most trepidation, and that is correctly pronouncing these names. So I apologize in advance for brutalizing all of your names. It is unintentional. But I'm going to present everyone. I'm just going to read their bios as you have in your program, and for the benefit of those watching online, as my colleague Sean said before, you have Google all in your hands right now. I'm sure you can find out more about them. And in order of their discussion, we are very grateful to have the Minister of Justice of Latvia, Ms. Ines Libiana Agrenes, which I'm sure that was a bad first effort. We have speaking on the video, which will be in Ukrainian. So for those to highlight who do not speak Ukrainian, for your translators, Mr. Andrei Yermak, the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, head of the Coordination Council for the Protection and Safety of Children, as a consultative and advisory body under the President of Ukraine. After that, we have Ms. Eliza von Hodenforge, the founder and executive director of the Lemkin Institute. And finally, we have Ms. Cecile Hellesveit, fellow at the Norwegian Academy of International Law. So without further ado, Minister, please, your opening remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all distinguished guests. It's an honor for me to represent here the Latvian government and especially the Ministry of Justice, knowing that the legal help in any ways to bring the perpetrators to justice and to help Ukraine to achieve justice and bring Russia accountable is one of our most priorities of the Ministry of Justice and in the government itself. And as the earlier panelists already discussed, it's of course not an easy task not to replicate everything what was said, but it is so important that we acknowledge that these awful tactics and psychological terror for the children kidnapped, these actions constitute a violation of Geneva Convention. It constitutes acts of genocide and constitutes war crimes. And this is a strategy which serves immediate military interests by pressuring Ukrainian society and government, while also aiming to project Russia as a protector of children for both domestic and international audiences. And of course, additionally, it's also a part of a demographic strategy to address Russia's declining population by integrating Ukrainian children into Russian society. So we should bear in mind also these very cold-minded strategic tasks as well. So while these barbaric war crimes are more or less exposed to the international community, we see that actually even after 2 years, the war started, there is some kind of limited willingness to intervene. And it's maybe more understandable how to give some aid in money, how to give some aid in legal resources. But here you need really another kind of thinking what we can do. And I still think that we can do a lot, and maybe this is not like only like legal steps we can do, but I would like to propose here 3 critical steps, which I think everyone can do, not only lawyers or ministers, but actually everyone can do. And firstly, it's documenting the crimes, and this is not only about the legal documentation in the register of damages, but actually everyone can document in an era of social networks that these evidences can be used afterwards. So it's so important to document all kind of stories and which might help tracking these children's whereabouts, and also help between governments, NGOs, and also international agencies afterwards track those children. We saw also the stories that some of the documentaries made by Russian propaganda actually helped the children come back afterwards. The other, secondly, step, which is more international legal instrument, it is to find all kind of diplomatic and political channels. And this is, of course, primarily for us, European, Western countries, but actually, as we see, there are also channels which are now used from other countries, which can be helped through the NGOs, that they actually can contact the families. Sometimes they even so-called buy out the children, which shouldn't be a legal action, but it's reality. And I think in these times we should take into account all means which could help the children. And thirdly, recognizing the immense psychological impact, I think it is so important that we actually prepare a system of rehabilitation for the children before they might unite with their families or relatives in Ukraine as well. And as we also saw in the first panels here, there are so many needs. So these are my preliminary remarks, which are maybe not really legal from the way the Minister of Justice should say, but I think here we should really think out of the box and of course hold Russia accountable for all war crimes. But these children, they are actually a sideway of this war. This war on children is a sideway war, and we should tackle those crimes immediately today, not waiting until we, of course, all believe we will bring Russia accountable. But today we have to act for every kid. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. In addition, what I really liked about your 3 steps was where you began, when you talked about how everyone can play a role. It reminded me of, I worked at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and when it was operating, that it was actually a grant, a very small grant from the State Department to actually Yale University, who we have some of our colleagues there from Yale here today. And it was more or less one man who went around collecting Khmer Rouge documents for years. And then when we were prosecuting that case some 30 years later, those documents were critical, were absolutely critical. So yes, you're completely right about how everyone can play a role in justice and accountability. It's not just for lawyers and investigators. So with that, I turn it over to our technology colleagues to put on Mr. Andrei Yermak's comments. And again, this will be in Ukrainian as far as I've been told.
Шановні колеги, вітаю всіх. Дякую за вашу увагу до долі наших дітей, яких вкрали російські агресори. Як сказав колись Нельсон Мандела, немає більш глибокого розкриття душі суспільства, ніж те, як воно ставиться до своїх дітей. І Україна продовжує боротися за своїх діточок. І ми не зупинимось, поки не повернемо усіх додому. Масштаби злочину та кількість страждань, завданих українським дітям, безпрецедентні. 16-річного Владислава з Мелітополя окупанти досить довго тримали у буцегарні. Майже цілодобово він чув крики українців, яких катували агресори. Час від часу хлопця змушували вимивати калюжі крові у катівні. На очах у Владислава помирав чоловік, який не витримав трьохдобових катувань струмом та порізав собі вени. Інших дітей окупанти жорстко били та катували. Багатьох насильно розділили з батьками у так званих фільтраційних таборах. Ми маємо свідчення знущання над дітьми під час так званого оздоровлення в окупованому Криму. Росіяни роблять все можливе, щоб ускладнити процес пошуку та повернення. Дітей постійно переміщують. Їм видають нові документи і російське громадянство, щоб стерти будь-які сліди. Вони заохочують усиновлення наших дітей. Чинять тиск безпосередньо на самих дітей через підкуп, погрози, розрив будь-яких зв'язків з родичами. На жаль, для всіх нас глобальна система безпеки виявилася неефективною. Не було запропоновано жодних рішень чи інструментів, щоб зупинити масштабну російську агресію. Нічого, щоб захистити наших людей. Нічого, щоб зупинити викрадення українських дітей. Нічого, щоб забезпечити їх безпечне повернення додому. Але ми не зупинимось і шукаємо рішення. За ініціативи президента України ми започаткували Bring Kids Back UA. Цей план дій охоплює всі аспекти цього трагічного питання. Від повернення дітей до їхньої реінтеграції, від адвокації до розвитку сімейних форм виховання, від документування злочинів Росії до міжпарламентської взаємодії. Наш моральний обов'язок – знайти рішення, які спрацюють. Для цього маємо об'єднати міжнародну спільноту в глобальних зусиллях з повернення наших дітей. Зрештою, маємо убезпечити дітей у всьому світі від подібних злочинів. Кілька тижнів тому ми створили міжнародну робочу групу Bring Kids Back UA, співголовою якої є баронеса Гелена Кеннеді. Група об'єднання експертів високого рівня з гуманітарної, юридичної та дипломатичної сфер, а також визнаних фахівців у сфері захисту дітей. У світі немає жодної країни, здатної самотужки впоратися з цим величезним викликом. Для координації спільних зусиль на рівні держав ми створили міжнародну коаліцію країн за повернення українських дітей. Ми дуже вдячні Канаді за цю ініціативу. 2 лютого відбудеться друга зустріч коаліції, яка буде присвячена технічним та практичним крокам, як учасники можуть допомогти Україні повернути наших дітей, аби вони знову змогли опинитися вдома у безпеці. Повернення усіх українських полонених та викрадених дітей – один із найважливіших пунктів запропонованої президентом Володимиром Зеленським формули миру, над реалізацією якої вже працюють понад 80 країн зі всіх континентів. І ми дуже вдячні кожному з депутатів Парламентської асамблеї Ради Європи, які одноголосно минулого тижня ухвалили резолюцію на підтримку українських дітей. Документ закликає національні парламенти усіх держав-членів Ради Європи ухвалити рішення, які б визнали депортації, примусове переміщення та невиправдані затримки з репатріацією українських дітей злочином геноциду. І я хочу висловити величезну подяку абсолютно всім, хто не може залишатися осторонь і допомагає у нашій благородній справі. Навіть просто розповсюджує інформацію про російські злочини та долю українських дітей. Світ має знати правду. Українці дякують всім вам. Дуже вам дякую. Слава Україні!
Mr. Yermak, for those words, which in the beginning made me realize how much depravity is a blueprint almost across conflicts. I mean, to hear that the types of things that not only, of course, the deportation, but what children are being faced to do and other levels of criminality, but also heartening to hear his words about the level of support that Ukraine is receiving and all these important initiatives in that regard. So now we turn to Eliza for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank, of course, I want to start by thanking the organizers of this event for the invitation to participate. It is really a great honor to be here and to be part of this important initiative to return all stolen Ukrainian children to their homes and to their identity. So I work with a genocide prevention organization, and our goal is, of course, to prevent genocide. And one of the reasons that it's so important that we recognize the genocidal dimensions of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, particularly the transfer of children, is so that we can make better policies, recognizing red flags before conflict and during conflict are incredibly important for making the right policies, policies that have the best chances for a good outcome for victims and survivors. The Lemkin Institute has been tracking the genocidal aspects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine since before February 2022, when Russia invaded. We were placed on alert in particular by Vladimir Putin's denial and therefore his criminalization of the Ukrainian identity in his speeches before the invasion, which signaled to us that he intended to destroy the Ukrainian identity in whole. His accusations against Ukraine, that it was committing genocide against Russians in Donbass, were another red flag for us, as Putin was employing a very common tactic used by genocidaires, which is called projection or mirroring, when perpetrators accuse their soon-to-be victims of committing the very crime that the perpetrator intends to commit against them. We noted our concerns about a threatened genocide in our first statement on the invasion from February 26th, 2022. At that point, we weren't sure if Putin would put his genocidal intent into action. And we followed up with a statement on genocide in Ukraine on March 20th, in which we laid out the evidence of genocide on the ground. Between February 26th and March 20th, Russia's actions on the ground signaled that Putin intended to put his publicly stated genocidal intent into action through the indiscriminate shelling of cities, including hospitals and schools and other buildings that are off limits in war, through the brutal siege of Mariupol, and through the kidnapping and forced displacement of people in regions it occupied. At this point, we were not aware of the forcible transfer of children in particular. Since that time, the evidence of genocidal intent has only mounted. In particular, Russia is guilty of specific atrocities, what I've called in my own scholarly work, life force atrocities, that are highly correlated with the crime of genocide. We find them in all genocides. These include gang rapes, rapes in front of family members, symbolic mutilations of bodies, symbolic violence against the Ukrainian identity, the separation of families, and of course now, as we know, the transfer of children. We were alerted to the transfer of children, to this particular crime, by the Regional Center for Human Rights, a Ukrainian-based NGO staffed mostly by wonderful young lawyers. And they had been documenting the transfer of children by Russia from Crimea, from occupied Crimea, since 2014. They had already identified this crime as a possible indicator of genocidal intent. And I think their work is an example of how important it is to recognize red flags of genocide in order to make good policy. Perhaps had we taken those crimes more seriously, the crime of transfer of children, as evidence of possible genocidal intent, we would have crafted better policies. The international world would have crafted better policies between 2014 and 2022. Russia's policy of separating Ukrainian children from their natal home and transferring them to the Russian nation and to the Russian identity is, I believe, one of the clearest indicators of genocidal intent that we have in this war. Its victims are not only the children themselves, as has been pointed out by many, who suffer terribly from this violation of their rights, but also their families, their wider communities, and the nations, since children really are the sacred treasures of collective life, and their harm affects ever-widening circles of people. We have seen this in many previous genocides. This is one of the reasons that the transfer of children is recognized as an act of genocide in Section 2E of the Genocide Convention, and is also understood in scholarship as a core feature of the genocidal process. We have seen children transferred to the perpetrator group in many cases of genocide, including the settler colonial genocides in North America and Australia, the Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923, the so-called Dirty War in Argentina that is increasingly being interpreted as a genocide, and the ISIS genocides against the Yazidi and Christian communities of Iraq and Syria. The transfer of children was also, as we know, an integral part of the Nazis' genocidal domination of Eastern Europe in the form of the Lebensborn Project. At the Lemkin Institute, we view the transfer of children to be a pattern of genocide in its own right, for it constitutes an assault on the organizing principle of group identity, which is the family, however we define that. By transferring children, perpetrators simultaneously appropriate the biological resources of the target group, enriching their own group in the process, and destroy the identity of the target group through the immeasurable harm, long-term harm caused by the separation of families and the destruction of communities. Despite the ubiquity of the transfer of children during genocidal processes, it is in fact a neglected crime of genocide, or at least within international jurisprudence on genocide, which has focused primarily on killing and mass murder as evidence of genocide. That is on paragraph 2A, pardon me, on Article 2A of the Genocide Convention, which is killing members of the group. So in this way, I think Ukraine's efforts to call attention to the genocidal nature of the transfer of children and to find justice for this crime and to bring the children home are a positive intervention in international law and will move forward our global understanding of genocide in very productive ways, thus helping humanity in the future, thus helping future communities who are threatened by genocide. Sometimes the most critical evidence of genocide is not killing, but efforts to undermine group cohesion as a way of destroying the group, which are covered in other parts of the Genocide Convention. And transferring children is one of the clearest ways to undermine group cohesion and one of the most effective ones. The implications of ignoring the genocidal intent of Russia's transfer of Ukrainian children, and I think they're very important, these implications, are that we all then will continue to live in a world where one of the most harmful forms of genocidal destruction continues to go unrecognized and unpunished, granting impunity by failing to publicly condemn its true nature. International failure to recognize genocidal acts is a form of denial and a means of granting impunity for genocide to current and future genocidaires. We must all continue to build the case for genocide, therefore, in legal circles, in official circles, and in global public opinion, so that increasing numbers of people begin to see the existential threat to the Ukrainian identity that the transfer of children poses. In the transfer of children, we see the threat very clearly. Justice and healing demands that we recognize the genocidal nature of this threat, and our shared humanity demands it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. That when you define mirroring, that such a horrible tactic that we do see constantly across different conflicts. And what I really wanted to highlight of what you said, with successful genocide cases in court, it requires that multifaceted, deep analysis that you're talking about. Particularly bringing to light things that are not so facially, we don't really see right away. With data analysis, with other forms of deep analysis, that is really important to be shedding that light on the possibility of any type of crime, but certainly with respect to genocide. So without further ado, our final opening remarks. Cecilia, I turn over to you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And thank you to the Latvian host for the invitation and the honor of participating in this most important conference. I'm an international lawyer and a conflict researcher, and last year I served as an international independent expert under the OECE Moscow mechanism, and I co-authored the report on deportation and forceful transfer of Ukrainian children by the Russian Federation. It was presented to the OECE states in May of last year. And let me also convey my sincerest condolences to the Ukrainians present for the continuing crimes being committed by the Russian Federation in not bringing the situation with the deported children to an end. Now, I will make 3 points in terms of international law and the Russian deportation of Ukrainian children. I will limit my presentation to the laws of armed conflict, humanitarian law, and international human rights law, since Elisa has made the case for genocide. Now, these norms are the norms upon which the criminal jurisprudence is made. So, international criminal law, as expressed in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, is based upon the norms of IHL. They're not always the same. International criminal law requires a qualified violation, while you can still violate IHL. And in this subject of deportation, there is a range of different types of violations. Some of them amount to war crimes, some of them are violations, and they are systematic, and they are very serious, although they do not necessarily, in and of themselves, individually amount to that gravest type of violations. Now, firstly, as former Latvian President Ms. Freiberger recalled, with this little resilient boy and his mother in the previous panel, this is war. It's an exceptional situation. In situation of peace, deportation is lawful under international law, within certain boundaries, certain exceptions. Now, in situation of war between two states or more, this changes. Deportation is prohibited. That is the point of departure, with certain exceptions. Now, there is one situation where there is no exception, and that is when there is forceful transfer or deportation of unaccompanied children into the hands or territory of the enemy belligerent. This is totally prohibited. If children are without their guardians or parents, the non-consensual transfer or deportation of children is a violation of the laws of war, often and increasingly amounted to a range of different war crimes. This is the first thing. Now, secondly, unlike the question of acts amounting to genocide, which is, as we know, often a controversial question, there are a number of different processes going on, and states disagree on this issue. The situation we're talking about when it comes to IHL and human rights law, this is not complicated, it is not complex, it is not controversial. It is strikingly simple. The rules are stated in the Geneva Conventions, to which all states in the world are ratifying parties, and the additional protocol, where the rules on children are customary in nature, thus binding all states in the world. These rules have the purpose of protecting children from the scourges and scars of war, and to shielding their families from the grief of loss, and to guard each belligerent party to the armed conflict and their populations against the unbearable prospect of losing their future generations, either to the war itself, meaning that they lose their life, or losing them to the enemy belligerent. And this is what is at stake here. These children represent the future of Ukraine. They are currently in the hands of the enemy party, being brought up as if they were Russians. It's another way of losing out. So there is an absolute prohibition under international law, and there is a shared interest, and this is an important point, there is a shared interest of all states in the world in preventing children from becoming an instrument of war. So this is one of the most uncontroversial parts of the international law of war. Now, I would just go into some of the findings that the mission found last year. We looked at the situation as it was 1 year ago, in April of last year, and we divided the situation into 3 different parts. The transfer by the Russian Federation of Ukrainian children, then the treatment of the children in Russian hands, and thirdly, the return of the children. Now, when it comes to the transfer itself, in certain circumstances, the Russian argument that this was done for medical evacuation or evacuation out of zones of hostility had merit. Other situations were deeply unlawful, particularly when Russian forces were retreating from Ukrainian occupied territory, bringing along children, deeply unlawful. And the most disturbing point with respect to filtration, where children are being separated from their parents, perhaps because there is no detention facilities, but it appears to be an instrument of punishment, and this is deeply unlawful under the laws of war. But whether or not the original reason for the deportation or transfer of children is lawful or unlawful or war crimes, international law requires that the children must be returned. There must be a return of the children. There must be a system for the return of children. Under the 4th Geneva Conventions, you need to have information, national information bureaus. They must constantly collect and update information on the whereabouts and identity of these children. Now, that is a system that is wholly lacking with the Russian Federation. So the mission found that while the Russian Federation had a pretty good system for transferring Ukrainian children into the hands of the Russian Federation, it had no system, which it is obliged to do, to transfer them back, returning them to Ukraine or to third countries. Because since this is a war between 2 states, third states are also brought into the equation. Third states have an obligation to facilitate that these children do not remain in the hands of the Russian belligerent, because that is the core of the illegality under these rules. Then we looked at the treatment
of the Ukrainian children in Russian custody. And here, of course, there is a range of obligations under IHL and under human rights law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child to protect these children. They must be treated humanely, they have special needs, and there is the special interest of the child. And as we also heard from the witnesses of the children this morning, and in line with what the mission found, many of these rights of the child are disregarded or violated in Russian custody. Actually, an entire panoply of rights are violated. Most importantly, the right to identity. When these children are absorbed into the Russian educational system, into Russian families, into the Russian language, their identity is slowly being removed. And this is basically the core of the issue, because it is not necessarily about how they are treated. Are they treated as if they were Russian children? Even if they are treated better than Russian children, there is a big problem. In fact, this is a situation in which it is the very presence of these children in the hands of Russians that is the problem. The better they are treated, the faster the assimilation may go. So we are in a kind of a special situation when it comes to the right of the child in this situation. It's counterintuitive, of course. The better the children are treated, the more serious the crime. But this is the situation. Thirdly, and finally, this can be solved. Unlike most of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that I deal with in my work, they are not irreversible. This is a reversible situation. And as time goes by, the seriousness and gravity of this crime increases. Children are extremely vulnerable to become lost to the enemy in a massive war such as the one that Russia is conducting against Ukraine. And there are clear obligations on Russia to facilitate the return of these children to Ukraine, or if the Russians argue that conditions in Ukraine are not satisfactory, the Russians have an obligation to make sure that these children are transported into third countries in waiting for the situations in Ukraine to change. There are clear obligations under both IHL and human rights law on third parties to do what they can to bring this situation to an end. And I would also emphasize that the Geneva Conventions, Article 1, makes it both a right and a duty on all ratifying states to the Geneva Convention to make sure that the conventions are respected at all times. This is not irreversible.
Thank you. Indeed. Thank you, Cecile. I was thinking when you were refreshing our memories, which doesn't need any refreshing, but still needs to be verbalized, how extremely vulnerable children are in these situations. And we sometimes see them as so brave dealing with this, but the lasting impacts, both short-term and long-term, are so significant. And one other thing I would be remiss to also not bring up the crimes against humanity. You did such a tour de force of international humanitarian law, and for the benefit of those watching online and here in the audience, crimes against humanity is a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population with enumerated crimes underneath it, one of which is deportation, another one of which is persecution. And so one thing to kind of topic du jour that's happening in the international legal sphere is that crimes against humanity is a customary international law. It is nothing like, as Cecile was talking about and as Elisa was talking about, we're talking about conventions that currently in New York, and the International Law Commission is working on a crimes against humanity convention, which is incredibly important, not just because of the need for a definition. We already have the definition. But for all the other, as you were saying, Cecile, all the other obligations that then puts on a state, particularly mutual legal assistance, things I'm sure the minister here is dealing with all the time now lately. So now to some questions. So the audience knows, and everyone online, I have not prepared them. They're being put on the spot So to help prepare them a little bit, I wanted to ask one question first to Cecile and Elisa, and then one to the panel, to give you some time to think about my second question. A little bit of an easy one, but this is something, Elise, you were mentioning to me over email, and I think it's important to say, what is the normative and legal response to Russia saying, we're doing this to protect children? We're doing this to help them. Why are you trying to come after us, make us look bad? We're actually protecting these children. So I'd like for you to strike upon that. And my second question is, again, a theme that I've been talking about what we can learn from other conflicts. Given the fact that all of you have worked in other conflicts, given the fact that Latvia is a longtime supporter of the International Criminal Court, having been involved in different conflicts around the world, what are the lessons learned, be it both at a legal and or a political aspect? What are the lessons learned that we can help the Ukrainians with, that the Ukrainians should be made aware of, that we have an obligation to bring those lessons learned to them? So I'll start again with my first question, because I think it's important to touch upon pushing over this defense by the Russian government. And then if you guys can all then discuss about this lessons learned question, that would be most appreciated. I leave for all of you to decide who dives in first.
Well, I'll hop in first in terms of the response to Russia. I mean, this was a war of choice for Russia. Russia stated that it was preventing genocide in invading Ukraine. That is now at the ICJ. We're going to hear their determination about whether or not Russia was abusing the Genocide Convention in saying this. There is really no evidence that Russia was preventing genocide, and this again was a type of mirroring that Russia was doing. So, you know, it's an excuse, but it's also further evidence of genocidal intent against Ukrainians. So this was a war of choice. So to protect children, Russia could stop the war, and it could give back the territories that it has claimed from Ukraine. That would be the way to protect children in this context. But I think there's another layer here. When Russia says it's protecting children, if, say, it's not protecting children necessarily from the war zone, what else could it be protecting children from? Well, President Putin has said that the Ukrainian identity is a criminal identity, that politicized people in Ukraine who believe in this Ukrainian state are criminals. And so in that way, this statement that Russia makes, that it's protecting children, is further evidence of genocidal intent, in that it could also mean that Russians view their transfer of children as a liberation of Russian children from this false Ukrainian identity that their parents and their communities have imposed against them. That is a very genocidal way of thinking. It's part of a denial of identity strategy that certain genocidaires do use. So those are my responses, is that Russia's attempts to sort of whitewash its crime in a way further support the argument that Russia is committing genocide and threatens the existence of Ukraine and Ukrainianness as such. Thank you.
Okay, so I will give the answer from the perspective of humanitarian law.
Yeah.
And as I said, there are no exceptions to this rule. This is a prohibition to which there are no exceptions, meaning that intention is irrelevant. It is prohibited, period. Now, I do believe my experience with countries at war, with populations at war, is that there are a lot of psychological mechanisms that hit in for everybody. Now we're talking about, you know, the average Russian family in Russia. They are subject to an enormous propaganda pressure. This is what happens to any population at war. They believe that they are rescuing these children. A number of them, well, some do it for money, some do it for other reasons, but some of them do it for their good of hearts. They do believe that they are doing the right thing. It does not change the fact that it is a crime. And it's important because in genocide, intention is so important. When it comes to war crimes, intentions are irrelevant. These are absolute rules. Precisely for this reason, that there are no exceptions. Now, this is one of the things. So whatever the Russian authorities are saying to justify that they are not following these rules, it does not matter. Point number one. Point number two, there is a more cynical analysis to this, and we also touched upon this in our report, that the information bureau system and the communication between the two belligerent parties, the Ukrainian state and the Russian state, does work to some extent when it comes to the third Geneva Convention, which is about prisoners of war, because Russia has soldiers in Ukrainian captivity, and Ukraine has Ukrainian soldiers in Russian captivity. There is a reciprocal interest of complying with the system. When we move over to the fourth Geneva Convention, we are talking about populations under military occupation. And in the Russian mind, there is no occupation. This is a new Russian territory. So that brings on a more cynical dimension to this, that the Russian Federation is complying with some of its obligation when it has a reciprocal situation, but it does not when it does not have a reciprocal situation. And these are things that states ratifying members to the Geneva Conventions not only have a right to push Russia on, but I believe they have a duty to do so, and I also believe that they have a strong, deep interest, because the signals of the world is that we are moving from a period where the Geneva Conventions regulating wars between states has not really been a part of our world. For the last 3 decades, 95% of the armed conflicts in the world have not been between states. But seemingly, we might be heading, unfortunately, for a period where these rules are going to be much more important to protect populations, civilian populations, and children.
Thank you indeed. So now going to my second question, and thank you again for that tour de force, both of you. Starting with you, Minister, lessons learned. What have we learned in the past from other unfortunate conflicts, from your perspective as a Minister of Justice, political again or legal? What are these lessons that we should be imparting on the Ukrainians, our obligation to tell them?
Thank you for this really so important question, because now being in the 21st century, I think we should look back to the 20th century and the lessons learned looking back to the Second World War.
Yeah.
The so-called winners of the Second World War, Soviet Union, was never held accountable for the war crimes they have done here on the soil of Latvia and the other democratic states, occupying them, taking children and other people into deportation to Siberia. And that was actually in the eyes of the international community, but that was never, ever taken seriously as a subject of a war crime for decades. And now, looking back, we actually see that this seed of colonial thinking and colonial dreams of Putin is actually rooting back to the Second World War. And this is one of the most important lessons learned, that whatever the political situation is, and how important it is to remain in peace for the time being, it's so important always bring those war perpetrators for trial, always. And I think we should never ever come back to the situation that there are some kind of people called winners, which don't obey the international law, the humanitarian law, and actually are not held accountable.
Thank you, Minister, to bringing that back right here, as you said, to Latvia, and hearing your words about what are the knock-on effects if we don't have accountability. It goes to show that there's a lot of brilliant academic researchers that have shown through empirical evidence that when countries make that very difficult choice, very difficult political choice to look inwards and hold accountable themselves, or of course belligerents that have affected them, that there's a higher percentage chance of durable peace. There's a higher percent chance that these countries will be democratic. There's a higher percentage chance that those countries will have a deeper recognition and respect for human rights. So your words, Minister, certainly resonate with me and the evidence that is out there. So to my other questions, Elisa, please, lessons learned.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate this accountability is so important for all the reasons both of you stated. And actually, countries or societies that do not look inward after a mass atrocity event are 3 times more likely, this has been statistically shown, than other countries to engage in mass atrocities in the future. And so perhaps Russia has been a problem for a long time that was ignored, right? And now we see the consequences of ignoring Russia's crimes during and before and after World War II. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very important. Lessons learned, I think another is that justice can be very slow. It's very slow for so many survivors of genocide. The Armenians are still dealing with a state that committed genocide against them that denies it, and there haven't been effective justice processes for that. So it's incredibly important. Hopefully we'll have a better outcome with Ukraine, right, with this case, but it's also incredibly important, and I see the Ukrainians already doing this, so this is more a sort of show of support, but it's incredibly important to document, to write your own narrative, to get the story out, to teach it to your children, right, to incorporate this lived experience and the way that you define it into collective life, even in the absence of or in the presence of a slow-moving legal system. This is not to say I think accountability is the most important thing, as a matter of fact, but in terms of long-term resilience, that story building, right, and that reweaving of society in the wake of such a massive catastrophe is also incredibly important.
Please.
Very brief comment from
please.
me. I'm going to zoom a little bit out from deportation and just make one reflection. I have been working on the laws of armed conflict and conflicts in the world for now almost 3 decades. And most of those wars have been non-state, non-international armed conflict, or what we call common Article 3 situations. And in these wars, international law is not really well adjusted. It doesn't really fit. We don't have the institutions, we don't have the mechanisms, so we have gotten used to this kind of not so institutionalized instrument. And we have been saying for 3 decades, this is because we don't have wars between states. Well, guess what? That is what we have in Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's a war of aggression. It could end tomorrow. We know how. It doesn't. And for as long as it continues, we have a war between 2 states. We have the instruments for that. We have developed them from the Second World War in the 1990s with the strengthening of international criminal law as well. And this brings me to my point. This, to some extent, is the test. Will the system work for the type of armed conflict for which it was actually constructed? And if we don't get this one right, then God help us all.
Yes, I almost feel like ending on that word. It's, when hearing all that, it's just political will, political will, political will. We have the instruments, we have the ways, we have the pathways. its political will. I will end on one thing, because I know the organizers will appreciate that to stay close to on time. But I just wanted to share one vignette that part of my work. Late last year, I was down in Dnipro, meeting with prosecutors and investigators from the occupied zones of Luhansk and Donetsk. And actually, one of the cases that they brought up, unfortunately, of course, I cannot give you details for confidentiality purposes, but one of the cases that they did bring up was related to deportation of children. And I wanted to end with this to hit on a theme that we've all been talking about. It was so encouraging to see so many governments, NGOs, and individuals that they were getting evidence, getting materials from all these different sources to build those cases. And so, again, we're faced with such depravity and immense criminality, but to see the response, again, is enlightening. It is enheartening. And please, I say that for everyone to continue with your work in your various lanes, what brought you here to the conference and what brought you here online. So with that, thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the organizers. And I think we have a 15-minute gap now. Thank you.